Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 55 of Series 9. The question for today is, does Ayn Rand's Objectivism vindicate her principles of ethics and ethical egoism? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 5. So today I'm giving a presentation on Ayn Rand as part of my study of the phenomenon of value. I have previously argued that value is central to ethics, meaning and purpose, as well as other activities. And I proposed value as a principle of life in the form of an affirmation or a will to value, leading to a sufficiency or relative independence of value from cognitive support. My interest in Ayn Rand stems from the relation of her ideas to my own concept of value. That is, both in their ostensible similarity and in their difference. For example, she argues for the primacy of self-esteem and of the individual as the basis of other values. And this parallels my own view of the basis of values and the potential sufficiency of value. Yet we have crucial differences that I have yet to explain. One difference is between her notion of ethical egoism and a principle of personal survival, and my view of a value theory ethics which grounds all values within the individual, but determines those values with features like the will to truth, the will to value and other people, not just facts, logical reason and supposed relations with reality. Another difference is that she espouses an objectivist epistemology which neglects the function of value. There are many reasons for adopting relativist positions in epistemology which we will note in passing. For example, Kant's Copernican revolution that reality is produced by interaction between mind and the world. Yet my particular contribution derives from value theory and the neglect of value in general. Yet in Rand's work on objectivist epistemology, of that title, she nevertheless provides an interesting account of the origins and development of thought and reason, which parallels that of Locke and Kant, yet without acknowledgement of those sources. And this development assumes part of the basis of her objectivist epistemology. But her deeper basis of objectivism lies in the ideas of non-contradiction and reality as determined by scientific fact. Yet a knowledge of modern philosophy will already find problems in such a foundation. To begin with, non-contradiction may be an indication of truth, but it isn't an adequate or sufficient criterion. This is because arguments or statements can be non-contradictory but false due to a false premise. For example, all students are teapots, our dog is a student, therefore our dog is a teapot. Another problem, however, is that although Rand tells us what her foundations are, she doesn't explain why they are valid or exactly how they support an objectivist ethics. A further problem is the array of arguments against objectivist views. Rand is well aware of and refers to the modern consensus on the relativity of knowledge from Kant to postmodernism, and her arguments as well as her rhetoric are modelled to counter those views. This has several consequences for our inquiry. 1. We need not repeat the well-worn arguments for relativity, but look instead for limitations in Rand's thinking. And 2. Given the consensus of arguments against her, we must ask, why does she support the positions that she does? In my view, it is due to her lack of appreciation of the subjectivity of human thought and value. I have explained such a lack of appreciation of subjectivity extensively elsewhere. The first aspect of Rand's objectivism that we can look at is her view that we can have access to reality. In this respect, she says that objective validity is determined by reference to the facts of reality. And those facts are determined by science only if it employs what Rand sees as correct conceptual procedures. So on Rand's view, not all science has access to reality, only that which is subject to strict conceptual controls. She says that it must be subject to the strictest, contextually absolute definitions of concepts, unquote. Rand seems to have some awareness here of difficulties of absolute objectivism. This is because she then qualifies her objectivism with the form of contextualism. But every epistemological and scientific context is relative, which prevents absolute foundations. Aristotelian, Newtonian and quantum sciences are, for example, developments that haven't yet finished. And objective epistemological contexts are even further out of reach. Moreover, neither in practice nor in Rand's references to it can science be regulated or classified in the absolute way that she wants. Rand herself tells us that, for example, colour can be measured or calibrated in terms of light waves. However, this comment illustrates Rand's lack of appreciation of subjectivity. This is because colour itself is a subjective experience, not measurable in light waves. This is demonstrated by the fact that different creatures had different colour experiences, and these differences also throw doubt on the idea that science has complete access to reality. This is because science may have a pragmatic understanding of the world, but not access to reality. And that leaves aside the further question of whether reality can be a coherent concept. The nature of colour also raises doubts about Rand's typically scientific claim that everything can be measured. Yet she does add that there is no exact method of measuring the intensity of psychological processes. But Rand goes on to explain how even love might be measured with future techniques. Yet I find this unconvincing, as love cannot be either precisely defined or classified. But a stronger fact against measurement, even in the physical sciences, is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It is that we cannot know both the position and speed of a particle, such as a photon, with perfect accuracy. We could also mention computational undecidability and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Yet Rand's claims of objectivity and access to reality are foundations of a logical process leading to an ethics. And underpinning her above claims of objectivity, she cites fundamental axiomatic concepts. Rand tells us that axiomatic concepts are primary facts of reality, like existence, identity and consciousness, and that these are irreducibles that cannot be analysed or proven. I agree to some extent, except that, like every other concept, these axioms are anthropocentrically constructed, and phenomenologists do claim to analyse consciousness and existence with concepts like non-being. Others, including myself, analyse consciousness with structures like intentionality and temporality. Yet for Rand, axiomatic concepts are the foundations of objectivity and of reality. And with the right methods, she claims that we can be certain that, as she says, the table exists, the tree exists, I am conscious. Such claims may be adequate for everyday discourse, but philosophically we can say that something exists, but we cannot know exactly the supposed absolute nature of the perceived object. There are many epistemological reasons for this, including the nature of knowledge itself. Conversely, Rand claims that concepts of objects can be absolute, and that they have epistemological essences. But against absolute definitions of concepts, we could cite vagueness, ambiguity, and anthropocentricity. Yet Rand does reject a use theory of language which employs a relative theory of meaning, yet without referring to Wittgenstein by name. But Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning also argues against single epistemological essences. Again, I'm not going to make the argument here, I'm simply noting its authority and my agreement with it. And this is another stumbling block in the logical development of Rand's objectivist epistemology. In another apparent contradiction, Rand has told us that consciousness is an irreducible that cannot be analysed. But she also tells us that consciousness has a specific nature and that it is volitional. I find it contradictory that consciousness cannot be analysed and then describe it as volitional. And then she says that in knowing our nature as consciousness, we can know what to do. Yet, as we will see shortly, this equation between knowledge and action is even more complex than suggested. Human nature as consciousness might, for example, consist in choice or freedom which prevents fixed objectives. Yet I'm sympathetic to the idea of an understanding of consciousness as guiding choice through thought and action. That is similar to her principle of identity, that objects have identity or properties, as I also hold. I also hold that consciousness exists, and because it exists, it must have properties, whatever they are. Yet in my view, these properties are best explained in terms of structures like volition and choice. But volition and choice bring value into the world of human experience, and that value is key to human life, not Rand's objectivism. The concept of value also interrupts Rand's process of logical development in another way. That is, like Rand, Plato, Kant, and many cognitivists within analytic philosophy believe that a certain conception of things, or of the good, will necessarily motivate people to pursue it. This point has been argued in the long-standing cognitive non-cognitive debate, and we can also ask how Rand's objectivism engages the will and human values. Yet we can illustrate the point briefly with an example. That is, we can ask a leading question of, do we eat an apple because we desire it, or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively correct. Moral motivation is more complex and difficult to ascertain. But we can say that moral choices made without any affect or sentiment at all would be clinical decisions or mathematical assessments that would not include what is essential to morality. The idea that moral values can be derived from facts or reason is rejected more strongly in Hume's principle. It is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is or morals from reason. Hume's principle has never been unseated and thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. And on reading Hume, Kant said that he had been awoken from a dogmatic slumber. Again, I'm not going to argue the case here, but I can make a few explanatory points in Hume's favour. Firstly, Hume is pointing out a previously unrecognised relation to value that has to be accounted for, and that moral value cannot be surreptitiously smuggled into the equation by sleight of hand. Another argument for the is-ought constraint can be taken from the tautologist character. That is, nothing can be in a conclusion that isn't contained within its premises, neither properties or values. For example, given 10 rooms with 10 chairs in each room, Therefore 100 chairs, not 100 red chairs, are in all the rooms. And thirdly, the authority and significance of choice means that I can assert my values over dictates and injunctions. This isn't claiming free will or free choice, but that other reasons for action can be chosen than fact. All the above present some of the problems of Ayn Rand's objectivism in establishing moral values in general. But we also have to look at the problems of establishing Rand's particular moral value of ethical egoism. To find the basis of ethical egoism, on first appearances, it seems entirely rational to act in one's own self-interest. That is, acting on self-interest is right because living by other people's interests leads to social and political disorder. Justification of this view might be drawn from both capitalism and the idea of the selfish gene, and that likewise people should make decisions based on what's best for themselves. Rand adds that self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, unquote. She also claims that on her rational egoism, it's irrational and immoral to act against one's self-interest. She holds that rational egoism can't be properly justified without an objectivist epistemology, and rationality must hold one's own life as the highest value and happiness as the final purpose. Moreover, Rand goes as far as to say that altruism is not only evil but impossible. Yet to me, evil is a quasi-religious term, and altruism is impossible as an absolute, which it need not be. A more plausible view of altruism and egoism is to understand them as degrees of intent. So Rand's form of ethical egoism is quite rare, espoused by only a few like Ayn Rand and Max Stirner. Charles Grey Shaw is a moderate egoist tempered by sympathy, compunction and compassion. And Nietzsche's individualistic morality is about the development of certain individuals. One problem is that ethical egoism can impoverish the self socially and psychologically rather than enhance it. It teeters dangerously on the brink of prejudice, human hubris and narcissistic personality disorder. Thoroughgoing ethical egoists like Rand and Stirner are thereby difficult to find, and enlightened versions of informed self-interest, which include interests of others, are often preferred. In such cases, informed egoists may have to practice altruism to advance their own best interests, and thoroughgoing ethical egoism may therefore be self-contradictory and self-defeating. This is the kind of problem that assails Rand's ethical egoism or rational egoism, that is both rationalist and objectivist. That is, her rationalist objectivism fails to appreciate the scope and depth of subjectivity and value. It has a limited conception of self and of self-value that I have expanded elsewhere. And this wider view reaches out to include care and concern for other people. There isn't time to include explanations and arguments for this view here, but we can look to some of the similarities of my view with the underlying principles of Rand's ethical egoism. She says that she is challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that man must sacrifice himself to others. In this form, Rand's egoism begins to make more sense as breaking away from religious and social conventions. The social construction of an ethic of altruism can be illustrated by using the three-phase process of consensus, Objectification and Internalization of Thomas Luckmann and Peter Berger. In the first phase, there is agreement on what constitutes good behaviour. That is, most of us and most other people don't want to be subjected to crime or to be harmed. Secondly, there is a social objectification of this agreement of what other people want. And thirdly, these objectifications of what other people want are internalized by individuals, and this explains the feeling of altruism as a moral mandate. But the drive for human freedom and autonomy will resist this imposition, as well as that socially constructed theories of ethics are not philosophically adequate. Alternatives must be sought, and as no conventional theories are adequate, I have proposed a value theory ethics that I have argued for at length elsewhere. But Rand claims, I quote again, to be primarily the creator of a new code of morality, which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on an arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason. Yet 250 years before Rand, Immanuel Kant had already attempted to construct an ethics based on reason, without reference to religion or sentiment, yet claiming not to dispense with human subjectivity. But like Rand, Kant didn't have access to serviceable concepts of consciousness and value upon which a viable value theory of ethics could be constructed, as I have done. One point which illustrates the inadequacy of Rand's theory of ethics and value is her attitude to love. We have already noted that Rand holds that love might be measured in materialistic ways. Yet Rand also responds to the moral teaching of universal love with the injunction that we should love only those who deserve it. But this is a common idea, unexpected of Rand, but is typical of cognitivist selectivity. That is, cognitivists tend to regard both love and ethical attitudes as depending upon properties of the object. Alternatively, love and ethical attitudes can be taken as encompassing subjective states of the agent. That is, like Aristotle's magnanimity, or an affirmation of and a sufficiency of value. These states are excluded both by a rationalist objectivism and a truncated conception of self and self-interest that doesn't immediately include regard either for other people or for more subjective concerns. I'm also surprised that Rand resorts to the idea of people deserving benefits or losses, which invokes conventional value judgments about actions and their inherent outcomes. Yet Thomas Nagel's account of objectivity and subjectivity attempts to explain both sides of the argument. He explains that the subjective viewpoint as the internal first-person perspective that an individual has of himself. This view includes personal drives, interests and attitudes, as well as oneself at the centre of things. Conversely, the objective viewpoint regards oneself as one individual among many with similar concerns. But Nagel is nevertheless talking about the objective viewpoint as something adopted by people. He isn't talking about an absolutely objective viewpoint that is constrained in two ways. One is that the greater the degree of objectivity and detachment, the more subjective aspects of life are left out. And because subjective aspects of life are left out, the objective viewpoint cannot have a grasp of reality. This is, of course, an obstacle for Rand's notion of absolutely objective reality. Secondly, any claim of objectivity can only be relative and not absolute. This is because any objective viewpoint can always be superseded by a more objective viewpoint. That is because another viewpoint can always step back beyond that viewpoint without end. An absolute viewpoint would have to include viewpoints from everywhere, and that would be an impossible view from nowhere, the title of his book on the subject. In Nagel's view, ethics must embrace both these objective and subjective viewpoints. He holds that objectivity is the driving force of ethics which enables us to go beyond ourselves, but there is a danger of going too far and losing sight of irreducibly subjective elements. In Rand's case, there is some uncertainty about what she believes to be mankind's final objective. Her commentators disagree over whether it is happiness, the rational life, or personal survival. I won't adjudicate between these here, which might just arise from ambiguity in Rand's work. Yet what is evident is some endorsement of happiness, the rational life, and personal survival as human objectives. And some integration of these objectives can be found in a statement that, since reason is man's basic means of survival, that which is proper to the life of a rational being is the good, that which negates or opposes or destroys it is the evil. I have, however, previously discussed happiness in the context of utilitarianism and Aristotle's eudaimonia. My discussions of cognition also oppose Rand's claim that rationality is an end in itself. That leaves the limited space here to counter Rand's objective as personal survival. Yet the idea of personal survival as an objective isn't unique to Rand and can be traced back to animal instincts. Even Spinoza's conatus principle held that everything endeavours to persist in its own being, including man. And Schopenhauer's will to live is an incessant impulse that drives human action. But Nietzsche regarded the will to live as a principle for the decrepit, near to death. I have also previously explained how the right to life was thought to be the basis of all the other rights. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also tells us that survivalists like Kelly and Thomas, Gottfeld and Smith hold that survival is the source and final goal of all the actions of an entity, and that which gives point to all its other values. I will challenge this view shortly. But to first take up the biological argument, the idea that survival is the ultimate biological goal of all living things is inadequate. This is because on both Hume's is-ought distinction and More's naturalistic fallacy, moral principles cannot be legitimately established on biological drives. For example, such may and do include drives like sexual predation, domination and cruelty. Moreover, a blanket interpretation that there is a universal biological drive for personal survival is mistaken. Animals of many species risk their own lives for the sake of reproduction or for the protection of their young. But more relevantly, human beings operate on different motives with reflective consciousness. And many people, parents, soldiers and civil rights protesters give up their lives for others. And with respect to contradictions within or reinterpretation of Rand's own work, many of her heroes, from Kira in We the Living to Prometheus in Anthem and John Galt in Atlas Shrugged, eschew survival and risk their lives for the sake of the values that make their lives worthwhile. Stanford again tells us that Rand points out that individual survivalism as predatory behaviour would end up destroying or driving away the producers and thus destroying themselves. and that on such an ethics the human species would have perished a long time ago. But Stanford's encyclopedia concludes that her novels point to a richer conception of the final end than mere survival. Whatever Rand's position, another perhaps unexpected account of survivalism is found in religion in the idea of immortality. But immortality only pushes questions further back into the future rather than resolving them. In response to this realization, Wittgenstein remarked that the question is not whether immortality is a fact, but what problems that really solves. And Nietzsche's Eternal Return shows how immortality need not be a blessing, but the greatest horror. Such wouldn't be a wondrous salvation, but would be a terrible prospect, worse than oblivion. And to endure, much less enjoy such a fate, one would need some kind of solution to life. And survival doesn't in itself supply such a solution, it only offers more of the same. Yet the idea of survival as an ultimate human objective or value can also be the product of confusion, projection, and not understanding the non-transferability of value. With respect to confusion and projection, it's understandable how survival can become a value. That is, when confronted with the prospect of death, survival becomes the most urgent objective. And the value of survival becomes fixed in the psyche, even through changing circumstances. This is also a case of the false objectification of a subjective value. Perry, Mackey, and myself argue that there are no objective values of this kind. Another consequence of Perry's view is that value can't be transferred between different contexts or situations. Using the language of economics, we could say that value isn't fungible or it's not transferable. A practical example is the value of water to someone dying of thirst. But water is of less value in circumstances where water is in abundance. The social scientist Tristan Engelhardt can be seen to make the mistake in his view that knowledge is always value laden because it involves the costs of acquiring it. Here, the costs of acquiring knowledge are fallaciously transferred to knowledge in general. Knowledge is value laden due to the anthropocentric perspectives we always have of it. Another argument for the non-transferability of value is that value is a phenomenal state or experience that can't exist in the past or the future. Value can only exist as a present experience and only as the concept of value in the past or the future. So when we arrive in the future, the value of surviving may not be the same as it was in the past. These examples reveal a fallacy of transferring value used in the idea of survival as a final human objective. That is, we must survive to be conscious in order to have values, but these preconditions do not automatically give priority to these values in later contexts. And this is evident in cases where personal survival is relegated for some other value. Finally, we can note that Rand's objectivism is severely challenged by Perry, Mackey, Nagel, and many others. Mackey argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world and therefore no intrinsic values. His arguments about psychological propensities and the queerness of quasi-objective entities. I previously presented these arguments, so I won't go over them again in detail here. Yet we can conclude this study of Rand by distinguishing what she got right from what she got wrong. She got right the inadequacy of current ethical theory and self-sacrifice as a means of justifying existence. Rand got sacrificial justification as a social condition right, but not as a philosophical theory. She also rightly criticized the detachment of linguistic and analytic philosophy from the world, and these criticisms led to her endorsing self-esteem and the autonomy of the individual. Yet Rand's ethical egoism also led her to overlook the same trends in existentialism and humanist psychology. And a particular conception of self-esteem and self-interest was so narrow that it neglected broader aspects of the self, such as love, altruism, and concern for other people. She also copied the 20th century philosophy that she adored in its rationalist, cognitivist, and epistemological biases. This led to her biggest mistake of trying to establish an ethic almost entirely on facts and reason. And Rand consequently neglected subjectivity, consciousness, and value as a new basis for ethics. From the beginning, Rand's erroneous principle of identity led her to make contentious claims about consciousness on a questionable conception of rationality that led to an ethics and to an even less realistic political ideal. This presents a long line of reasoning that is contestable at every turn. Yet perhaps more devastatingly, her objectivism doesn't seem to be objective or impartial. Rand, for example, presents relativity as a kind of nihilism that moralists were also doing at the time. She also says modern philosophers try to demonstrate that concepts have no cognitive validity, and she unjustifiably accuses linguists of not relating words or propositions to reality. But these are cherry-picked examples from the fringes of extreme thought. So my conclusion is that her widely viewed lack of credibility isn't just due to her anti-social views, it is also due to her rationalism, lack of objectivity, and the quality of her philosophical arguments. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com or Philosophy of Value workshops.